What's up, everybody? My name is Anand from Strenght, and today I have a really special video for you guys. If you are new to my channel, my goal with this channel is to bring you the best information out there when it comes to strength training, nutrition, motivation, and much more. One of the ways I can do this is by bringing on guests that I consider to be some of the most knowledgeable people out there. So for my very first interview ever, I interviewed Izzy Narvaez from powerliftingtowin.com. Not only has Izzy been my own coach for the past 2+ years, but I consider him to be one of the top powerlifting coaches out there. His YouTube channel and his website Powerlifting to Win was one of my own inspirations for starting my own channel. Whether you want to learn about powerlifting training, programming, nutrition, or even competition, I believe that Powerlifting to Win is the #1 resource for powerlifters out there. Keep in mind that this is my very first interview ever, and if you have some suggestions for me that I can use to get better, then please leave them down in the comment below. And if there's any guest that you would like me to interview next, you can also leave that in the comment section below. I'd like to apologize in advance for the technical issues we had, and we were not able to get a video for this interview, but there's a lot of great information in this interview, and I'm sure that you will really benefit from it. Without further ado, I hope you enjoy this interview with Izzy from Powerlifting to Win. What's up, everybody? Today I'm super excited to bring to you the very first interview on my channel with my coach, whom I've had for the last 2.5 years, Izzy Narvaez of Powerlifting to Win. Thank you, Izzy, for joining me today and taking the time.
Yeah, man, glad to be here.
So, yeah, go ahead.
What was that?
So for the one or two people who may not know who you are, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm the creator of Powerlifting to Win. It's a informative powerlifting channel where, I've pretty much talked about everything related to the sport at this point, but there's a lot of information on there with like popular programs, what equipment to use, nutrition. So I've got 2 books as well. One is on nutrition specifically for powerlifting, and the other's for programming specifically for powerlifting. And I guess the general thrust of the site is that it's specifically for powerlifters, because when I first started making content for powerlifting, like if you typed in powerlifting into Google, like the first 4 search results were like from bodybuilding.com. So it's a lot different now, like 3 or 4 or 5 years later, where powerlifting is a lot bigger. But that's kind of like my background is I've been competing in powerlifting for 6 years now. Well, my best numbers are 1450 total at like 190 pounds.
Wow,
that's my background.
Yeah. That's really good.
Nice.
So, in my observation, like what I've seen is most of the people who get into lifting, they usually have some sort of like an adverse background, or they like the reason why I named my channel Underdog Strength is like they were probably underdogs in some area of their life, and lifting was an outlet for them or a way for them to get better. Do you have an experience like that? So how did you actually start lifting? Not powerlifting, but just in general.
Let's see. I think the first time I ever really lifted like barbells would be in like high school PE class. And I would say at the time I wasn't super like interested in it as much. If I at that time I was probably really only interested in doing like curls and abs, like I guess most people that age, but I was probably 14 or something like that.
That's the most important stuff, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's what life's all about at that age. But I got more into it in high school because, I guess, the adverse situation for me, I guess, was, I'm pretty short. I'm only 5'6" or so. So like 168 centimeters, I guess, for people out there who use the metric system. Mm-hmm. And but I always liked sports. I always liked playing sports, but I was too small to really be any good at most sports, because not only was I short, but like, when I graduated high school, and this is after I'd been lifting for a while, I was probably 140 pounds. So when I first started lifting, I was like 120 pounds. And most of the people, that I would be, the sports that I enjoyed, besides wrestling, since I was weight class based, but I liked playing football, I liked playing basketball, and I was just way too small, like way too small, and I didn't like being like that small and skinny.
Yeah, I think I've always had the opposite situation. I was like morbidly obese for most of my life, and I cut down basically, from my heaviest of 275 pounds to all the way down to like in the 150s.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, and so for me, it's the opposite. Yeah, I'm actually afraid of getting too big sometimes.
Yeah, I've been there. Like I actually, unlike I'd say a lot of people that start off skinnier, I've actually gone too far with it. Like when I first started, I tend to have a pretty extreme personality about this stuff. So when I started with starting strength, which at the time that I started lifting, that was pretty much the only thing anybody ever recommended to any beginner.
Right.
Back at the time, it was like popular to drink a gallon of milk a day. So I was drinking like a gallon of whole milk a day for like the first 9 months that I trained. And I got up to like 240, 245 pounds. I don't even know what the heaviest that I was, because I stopped weighing myself, because it was like there was some cognitive dissonance there that I didn't really want to believe how like heavy I had gotten. So, and it was not like, sometimes people hear like lifting and 240 pounds and they think that's like a good thing, but no, it was not a good thing. I was like 45% body fat, maybe, it's like really bad, like lifting, hundreds of pounds less than I do now. So I have some experience with that, but obviously that was like a temporary thing for me. Like I was only that big for 6-7 months, but I can definitely relate to not wanting to let my weight get out of control, because I've done that.
Right. So then why powerlifting? When you started lifting, how did you actually start powerlifting from just going to the gym and doing curls?
Yeah, so I have always been into like combat sports, because growing up I did a lot of wrestling. Wrestling was like my favorite sport. So when high school ended, I kind of looked for another outlet for that, and that was right at the time that MMA was becoming popular. And although I never got too much into MMA, one of the aspects of MMA is like jiu-jitsu and various kinds of like judo and wrestling. So I started doing that. And in order to get better at that, I lifted weights. And basically what I found was that over time, I realized that I liked lifting weights more than I liked doing jiu-jitsu or any other of the MMA stuff that I was doing. So I kind of got tired of like constantly getting hurt doing that stuff. And just one time I kind of hurt my knee, not like that badly. I just sprained it, but it was enough to not be able to do anything for like 3 weeks. And to rehab it, I was lifting, and it was probably the first time I've ever been lifting and not doing any other sports, like not doing tons of cardio and tons of other sports. And I got really strong, really fast compared to previous times. And I just decided to keep going with it. And ended up making, I remember I made like a conscious decision at that time where I was like, yeah, all right, well, I'm just done with doing other sports. I'm going to just lift.
Nice. So when you actually started powerlifting, what was your like first real powerlifting program that you followed?
The first what?
The first powerlifting program that you followed?
Oh, 531.
531.
Unless you want to count starting strength. But it was 531, which is really not even a powerlifting program. But
right.
Again, at the time that I started, when you looked on the internet for information about how to get strong, it was all bodybuilding.
Right.
100% of it was bodybuilding. So like nowadays you have guys like Mike Israetel and Greg Knuckles and all these guys putting out tons of science-based information about powerlifting. But like I said, when I used to look up stuff about strength training, and I got into strength training before powerlifting. Like powerlifting kind of came after that.
Right.
I had already been lifting purely for strength for like a year before I even really knew what powerlifting was.
Right.
There was no information. Like I said, you would type in like powerlifting, and then it'd be like a bodybuilding.com article that would say like, confuse your muscles with lower rep ranges or some shit like that. So it was totally different. So yeah, I didn't even do a real program designed specifically for powerlifting
Right.
until I'd already been lifting for 3 years. So really a different situation, I think, than what a lot of people have now, where they start off, doing powerlifting specific training almost too soon.
Hmm. So my first powerlifting, like real powerlifting program, was actually your novice program, which was even before Programming to Win came out.
Yeah.
So because I actually found your channel just when I was getting into powerlifting. Before that, I was just lifting for weight loss, and then slowly I started to enjoy just the main movements and getting stronger. So yours was actually the first powerlifting program that I ever followed.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. So that's awesome. So when you got into powerlifting, at what point did you decide to become a coach?
I never actually had any intention of doing coaching when I first made my website, but the reason why I did it is because at the time I had basically made up my mind. One of my goals at the time was to try and create an income source that was 100% online.
Mm.
So that was my goal, and I was learning really about that more than I was learning about powerlifting.
Mm.
I went through some of the process for identifying, a potentially viable business surrounding a content-based business. So something that I knew about, that I could write about. And to my surprise, out of all of the things that I considered, and I considered a lot of different things, because at the time, I had done, I taught and played chess for most of my life. So there's just other things that I knew a lot about. Like, I'm a huge sports fan. So, and the NBA, I did all this keyword research, and it turned out, like I said, that nobody was writing about powerlifting. Nobody was talking about it, making videos or whatever at that time. So it was kind of a coincidence. So I was like, well, this is something that I'm really interested in. No one else is talking about it. So I'll make some content about it, and we'll see how it goes. But my original plan was to do like, affiliate marketing with it mostly. Like, in my experience, here's the best belt that you should get. Like, here's the programs that work the best. But what ended up happening is that the website caught so much steam that I would literally be getting dozens of requests for people asking me to personally coach them. And so at one point, I just decided to, give that a try, since so many people, it wasn't even my idea. So many people wanted me to do that for them that I decided to try it. And, it ended up being pretty rewarding and making me, more money than anything else I was doing with the site. So it kind of, everything fit in really well to start doing that. And nowadays it's a super popular thing. Like, everybody is doing online coaching. Mm-hmm. But when I first started online coaching, I didn't even know that was a thing.
Right.
I didn't know, I knew a few other people that did it, but they were mostly bodybuilding coaches. Right. Who just did, very strict diets for people getting ready for shows.
Right.
But totally different than nowadays, where it seems like, every powerlifter you can find out there has their own program and people that they help. It's like there was no powerlifting specific programs that I even knew about besides Shaco.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's awesome. So since you've been coaching, I think you've been coaching for about 3 years now or more.
Yeah, around there.
So what are maybe the top 1 or 2 things you've learned from coaching?
Oh man, individual differences is more important than I ever realized. Okay, so I used to think that if certain people didn't hit certain, so let me back up. There's a saying that most people say in powerlifting where they say something like, you got to find what works for you. And I always thought that was kind of BS, because I was like, well, there's things that work for everybody. And then, there's just people maybe don't understand the reasons why this would work in this situation or why it wouldn't in this other situation. But then what I've realized through just coaching enough people, is that it's literally the case where something can work for one person, and in the exact or a very similar situation, it does not work at all for another person. They could
Mm.
be two similar lifters at a similar stage of development, and you give them something that should work, and it just doesn't. It just doesn't work at all. And that was a big eye-opening thing for me where, maybe you have like 80% of people who will respond predictably to certain kinds of programming, but then there'll be like 10% that are hyper responders. And then there'll be another 10% that like don't respond to it at all.
Mm.
So yeah, there's been some really interesting examples like that where I'll see people who it doesn't really make sense why this happens, but they'll make better gains for powerlifting with like really high reps, like 8, 10, 12, 15 reps.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like that shouldn't work based on, intensity and specificity for the sport,
Right.
but it does. And then I've seen other people where it's like, they don't do anything but singles, and that's the best gains they've ever had.
Mm.
So, and again, 80% of people respond predictably to more moderate approaches, but there's these weird outliers that I underestimated how frequently that actually happens.
Right. And speaking of individual differences, now, since powerlifting's gotten so much more popular, we have so many different types of lifters. Like, for example, we have so many more female lifters competing these days. It's almost like a 1-to-1 ratio these days.
Yeah.
So in terms of like differences between males and females, obviously there's going to be individual differences, but in general, what are some of the main differences between males and females in terms of training or training response?
So on a purely practical level, one of the things that you have to break down with that too is the actual size of the female.
Mm-hmm.
Because more often than not, female lifters are small. They're smaller, like, in height and in overall body weight. But that's not always the case. And so I've noticed that just like with males, larger females respond to programming completely differently than smaller females. But I would even say that there's more similarities between smaller males and smaller females of a similar size than there is between big females, like, like say a 6 foot tall female that's over 200 pounds. Then that there's more differences between that girl and the 5 foot flat girl who's 100 pounds than you would see between males and females. So, but in general, females can train a lot more. And in particular, they almost have to get the best gains possible. So there's a bunch of physiological reasons for this, but in the real world, what's really important is that you basically have to realize that females can train much more often than males, and they should as a result, because they can recover from it and make productive gains. So one of the biggest problems that I saw initially was that there was a tendency for females to chronically undertrain because they would use these American powerlifting programs that were like once a week for each lift. Like you do bench once a week, squat once a week, deadlift once a week.
Right.
Whereas what I've seen is that the average size female, and again, kind of have to exclude some of those taller, really heavier ones that almost respond more like males, is benching 4, 5, 6 times a week sometimes. Whereas the average male trainee for me, that let's say he's somewhere in like that 170 to 220 pound range, is going to bench 2 or 3 times a week. But those lighter females at 120, 130, 110 pounds, way more training has to be done to get them the best possible results. And I guess the other one too is that females just almost across the board have a little bit slower response to upper body progress. So it's just slower, takes a lot more work because they build muscle less quickly, especially in places that require, high androgen levels. But yeah, that's I guess the big one is that I think the biggest part of it is that because females are on average so much smaller and the absolute loads that they work with are also smaller, to me, I've seen a correlation between absolute load and how often you can train. So this also applies to like super heavyweight males who train with much larger absolute loads than even like their smaller male counterparts, and they cannot train as much. And a lot of those guys do better on once a week training. But then on the other extreme end of that spectrum is I've worked with like a 4'10" female who's 100 pounds. And if she's not training 6 days a week, squatting 4 days a week, pulling 2 to 3 times a week, and maybe doing some type of upper body every single training session, she makes minimal progress.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's the big one is just they train more. They have to train more to get the best results.
Right. So in terms of programming, what's your general, I'd say, like programming philosophy?
I'm pretty moderate at this point. So what I would say is like I use more traditional forms of periodization
Mm-hmm.
with a good deal of variety most of the time. So what's kind of the most popular right now, I would say, is especially among like USAPL, IPF competitors, is like hyper specific daily undulating periodization templates.
Mm-hmm.
And while I have seen that work really well, the problem that I have with it, and what I mean by that for those who are unaware, is basically they just do competition squat, competition bench, competition deadlift with very little variation. And the variation mostly comes in through rep ranges. So if they're benching 3 days a week, one day might be, 5 triples, the next day is 4 sets of 6, and then another day is, 3 sets of 9 or something. So the variation is mostly in the rep ranges throughout the week, which is what daily undulating periodization loosely is. But when I see people who do that make progress very, very fast, but they tend to have all these overuse issues. Just you get like these lifters, they're like 22, 21, and tendonitis in every joint imaginable. And it's like that shouldn't be happening at that age.
Right.
So my approach tends to be more variety, especially in the off season. And of course, I don't really know if there's a real off season in powerlifting, but by off season, I just mean further away. So
Right.
that's where I'll bring in things like, even if they're a wide stance low bar squatter, I'll prescribe front squats and narrow high bar squats. Or if they're a sumo puller, I'll have them doing deficit conventional deadlifts. And a lot of people would argue, that's not specific enough. But what I've found is that you can use these general strength builders in the off season that are superior in a lot of ways for hypertrophy. And then when you're getting ready for a contest, you can use the similar approach to the DUP programs with the high frequency, hyper specificity the last 4 to 6 weeks and get that peak. But then in the off season with, the little bit lower frequency and more variety, you avoid some of the constant overuse injuries with tendons and things.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, my general programming is it's moderate. If there's periodization, I don't do anything extreme. Like say on the one end of the extreme spectrum would be like West Side, where you do like a different movement every single time, and then there's your max out every week, or like the Bulgarian method, which is nothing but the competition movements and singles.
Mm-hmm.
I'm much more moderate amount of volume, moderate amount of exercise variety, and then I periodize things pretty normally. So higher reps further away from the meet and lower reps closer to the meet. I don't do a lot of exotic things because even though those programs are, sexier to most people and more exciting to run, they usually have problems that are introduced solely because of the extreme nature of the program.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So in terms of training progress, one of the biggest factors is training volume, right? If not the biggest factor. So would you agree with that?
Yeah, that's definitely the case. I mean, if somebody is under training, the quickest way to make them progress more quickly is to get them to an appropriate level of volume.
Mm-hmm. So for those of the listeners who may not know what training volume is, could you maybe explain it in short?
Yeah, so training volume is a really tricky one because there's a lot of different ways that you can think about it. So one of the most common ways, and one of the ways that makes the most sense, is to use tonnage.
Mm-hmm.
So tonnage basically is you calculate that by doing, the weight that you use times the reps that you did times the sets that you did. So if you did, let's say 100 pounds for, one set of 10 reps, then you multiply that 100 pounds by 10 and you get 1,000 pounds of tonnage. So that works pretty well as long as you're staying within powerlifting specific programming parameters. So what I mean by that is, say you're in that 70 to 90% range using the competition movements. But where tonnage doesn't work is, to give you the whole picture, is when you're using very light weights. So say 40 or 50% or something like that. doing a bunch of sets of 20 at 30% of your 1 rep max, even though you can get a huge amount of tonnage, is not going to have the same meaning as far as strength gains as getting that same amount of tonnage above 70%.
Mm-hmm.
The other issue with using tonnage as your sole measure of volume is that exercises don't have perfect carryover.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're comparing tonnage from, say, a leg press to the squat, you can get a ton more tonnage on the leg press because you're just, it's the nature of the machine. But it won't necessarily mean that even though you're doing more volume strictly by tonnage, it won't necessarily have the same training impact. So volume, in a more loose sense, in a loose definition, is simply the amount of training that you do. So the amount of, sets and reps and exercises. And giving it a more specific definition, in my opinion, can be useful as long as you give it context. But you got to keep in mind that we don't really have a definition of volume right now that covers everything, because each definition kind of has its own flaws. Mm-hmm. So roughly, a really rough way to think about it is, again, tonnage, or you could think about it as the number of hard sets that you do in a given training week. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of my preferred way of thinking about it right now, is the number of hard sets that you do in a week.
Okay. So when we keep a training log, right? We write down our sets and reps for each of our lifts. Do you think it makes sense to actually track the tonnage?
No. I mean, it can. It's useful, but where I think it depends on your programming. Like with my programming, a lot of times it doesn't, because I just don't think that when you're tracking, say, squat tonnage and bench tonnage and deadlift tonnage, if in one phase of your cycle the squat tonnage is being made up by paused high bar squats and front squats and maybe one normal back squat session, and then the next training block is 2 back squat sessions with the belt and, let's say, 3 count pause squat, also low bar, and you compare those two numbers, it's never bad to have data. Don't get me wrong. Data, you can always try to suss something out of the data, but what is that really telling you? In my experience, it does not tell you that much, like, to compare those numbers as equals. So that's kind of where I prefer the hard sets metric, as roughly sets done above RPE 6 to 7, mm-hmm. because then I know it gives me a better picture of what was being done, because especially with, say, something like front squats, where people can usually only use 60 to 75% of their normal back squat weight, mm-hmm. you might get this idea that they're not doing very much work based on calculating strictly front squat tonnage, when really front squats can be very taxing. And if you think that it's going to be equal just because you're using less weight, you did 10 sets of front squats that were all hard, but the same tonnage would have been had with 5 sets of back squats, still the 5 sets of back squats is easier to recover from, mm-hmm. even though you use more weight. So that's why that's the one thing about training, is that some of it is more art than science at times. And I would never encourage people to not collect data, but just you have to understand the limitations. So when I see people making training decisions solely based on tonnage, I just don't agree with it. Because to me, unless you're never doing anything but the competition movements, and then you're comparing apples to apples at least, mm-hmm. it doesn't give you the whole picture. Mm-hmm. It doesn't. And especially sometimes with my program, I'll have people doing something like dumbbell bench. The tonnage with dumbbell bench, what are you going to do with that? Like, it's, or even what if you're doing what if I have someone doing leg press, then that's going to drive the tonnage for squat. But a leg press is really not a squat. So, I mean, what does that go under? Leg tonnage? It's just, it can be useful in the right circumstances, but you have to recognize the limitations. Mm-hmm. That's why for me, it's a little bit of a lower priority, just with the way that I program, since I use more variety than other people.
And do you also keep track of your weekly volume?
What do you mean by weekly volume?
So instead of, the number of hard sets that you did for each training session, the total number of hard sets you did for the whole week, maybe, let's say you squatted 2 or 3 times a week.
I do that, mm-hmm. Loosely, but more closely what I pay attention to is lower body and upper body. Okay. So I'll have, I do have a number for like the total amount of sets done for the whole body. But what I found is really important is upper and lower specifically, because in a lot of ways your bench programming doesn't overlap that much with your squat and deadlift programming. That's not to say it has zero, right? Because bench only competitors, for example, can train the bench more often than people doing all three lifts, but not that much more. Whereas if you don't track squat and deadlift in a similar category, you'll overtrain really quickly if you're assuming that those two lifts are not related at all, because they're heavily related. And how often you squat or how often you deadlift and with how much volume and how much intensity really, really influences how often you can do the other one.
Right. So if someone is just starting out on a program, or maybe they're programming for themselves, what's a good volume to start at, or what's a good range for the number of hard sets they should aim for each session or each movement?
Yeah, so the tough one about this is that it varies so much across the demographics. So the number that if I give a number right in the middle, it's wholly inappropriate for people who are need the bigger numbers. And if I give a number, in the middle, the bigger lifters, it also doesn't quite work. But in general, what I would say for like what I'm most familiar with, so I'll kind of give you those numbers for middleweight males. All right. Usually what I see is a minimum of 5 to 10 hard squat sets per week is what's going to be needed for progress. And for bench, it's going to be between 10 to 20. And then on deadlift, it can be anywhere from 1 to 10. So some people need a lot less deadlifting than others, and some people will need a lot more. But rough, I guess if I had to like put a rough number on it, 5, you should try at least 5 to 10 squat sets, 10 to 20 bench sets, and you can start off with the lower end of those, and probably for deadlift to give it a slightly tighter range, 3 to 5 sets. That's so if I'm starting off with somebody and working with them for let's say like the very first time, the usual number that I will give them is 10 squat sets, 15 bench sets, 5 deadlift sets, and then I'll evaluate how they respond to that and then begin making adjustments. And of course, depending on the demographic, I'll shift that quite a bit. So a 300 plus pound male, I might half all those numbers initially, see how he or she, well, obviously it's a he, I said 300 pound male, see how he responds, and then adjust from there. And then for smaller females, sometimes I'll start them with almost double that. And then again, some of it comes down to individual response because, like I said, while there is a trend in the demographics, it's not absolute. So like a lot of people will ask me like, hey, Izzy, I'm 45. Should I train less? And my only answer I could give you is maybe. It's true that in general, older people have compromised recovery, but it's not an absolute rule. And sometimes older people can actually train more than younger people just because that particular individual, for whatever reason, has great work capacity. So again, you can start off with these baseline numbers, but then you have to see how you respond and continue to make adjustments because some people might get buried by 10 sets of squats in a week.
Right.
And other people, that's nothing.
Right. So, these days, terms like minimum effective dose and maximum recoverable volume, these are like pretty popular these days. Is there a way of finding out that, this is the minimum effective dose to make progress, or, going over this much volume is detrimental to progress?
Yeah, there absolutely is a way to do that roughly. So what you want to do is you want to design, let's say, something like a 4-week training cycle with a deload in the 5th week or something like that. And it could be slightly longer. But what you want to do is you want to start off with the baseline amount of volume, right? So we could go back to the numbers that I just said. So let's say that, we have a 200-pound male, and I'm going to start him off on 10 sets of squats, 15 sets of bench, and 5 sets of deadlift, roughly hard sets. So sets above, RPE 6 to 7. In week 1, I'll give him those numbers. In week 2, I'll add 1 to 3 sets to that amount. and we'll see how he responds. So does his performance improve going into week 2? If so, that's usually a good indicator that the previous amount of volume that we gave was appropriate. If his performance trends down in week 2, well, there could be a couple things that happen, right? One is he maybe not adapted to that volume yet, but let's say that, we've tried this once or twice already, and every time in week 2, his performance already gets worse. So that's already overreaching him in week 1. So what I would do is next time I ran the cycle, let's say, in week 2, his squat already goes down. I would say, all right, let's try starting you out with 7 or 8 hard sets on squat instead of immediately starting on 10. But what you want to do is you want to do this process, right, where you add 1 to 3 hard sets per week. And eventually, over time, if you take consistent notes, what you'll find is there's a range of sets, and it really will not be that big. It'll be, in 2 to 4 sets, where every time where you hit that number, you start to overreach. And by overreach, what I mean is that you'll feel beat up to a certain degree, and you won't be able to beat or even match your last week's performance. And the reason why I say you have to do this in, say, like a 4-week training cycle is that if you just train for 9 straight weeks without deloading, it might not be that the volume was inappropriate. It's just been such a long time, and you've accumulated enough fatigue that you're finally just tired from that much continuous training. But if you do a consistent cycle length of, say, 4 or 5 or 6 weeks, and every time you add 1 to 3 sets, and you take notes, and you see when does performance begin to go down. And that can help you adjust your volume numbers for the next training cycle. But it's something that has to be done over a long period of time with a similar training program, because if you're changing too many variables at once, you'll never be sure exactly what happened. Mm-hmm. So I guess, the simplest way I could put it is you start out with a certain amount of sets in week 1, you slowly add, and then over time you'll figure out kind of where that limit is. And then once you know where the limit is, it becomes a lot easier, because then you want to figure out, what is closer to the minimum amount that I can do. And then over a cycle, you'll build from maybe, say, just above that minimum amount all the way up to that amount that usually starts to overtrain you or overreach you. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of where you'll live as far as your volume goes. Mm-hmm. And that individualization process just takes a little bit of time and note taking, really. Mm-hmm. But that's how it's done. So it's unfortunately there's not like a formula that you can just plug in your stats and it'll tell you, but it has to be done like that. And sometimes there's outliers. So, there'll be people who really can only do 3 or 4 hard sets of deadlifts in a week. And then I've also seen crazy examples of, say, like somebody who needs to bench 30 hard sets in a week to make progress, and they don't overreach doing that. So, but in general, you'll get a good idea of it just through this process.
Mm-hmm. So one thing that I really want to learn more about is, long-term planning for an athlete, because, most of us understand things like designing like a weekly training program, but what about the long term? How do you actually plan for your athletes?
So I think the biggest thing that you need to think about here is what needs to be developed in the athlete, and what's the athlete's training schedule for the year in terms of what are the important contests that are coming up, important life events. So long-term planning can have 2 contexts, right? One is to make sure that you're preparing the yearly or 2 or 3 year schedule or whatever for the most important contests. But the other aspect of it is developmental. So like, what aspects does the athlete really need to work on that might not be as simple as, just get stronger. So sometimes developmentally people need to, there could be certain imbalances that need to be fixed, or mobility issues, or just developing technique. So if you know when the next contest is coming up, and if there's a big gap in the athlete's, let's say, skill set at that time, you want to make sure that you're leaving adequate time for developmental blocks. That's what I'll call them, to work on those things. So let's say a typical meet cycle could be consisted of 3 blocks, right? One would be, like a hypertrophy block, then a strength block, and then a peaking block for the meet. Mm-hmm. What I want to do in my yearly planning is, if it's not a more advanced athlete let's say it's not an advanced athlete who pretty much has everything set up And really our only concern is mostly just timing things correctly with the competitions that they want to do. If it's more of a novice or intermediate athlete that has something that we really need to address, I like extending things in there to make sure that I can have time here and there for developmental blocks to work on certain things that that particular athlete might really need. So one example could be, let's say that someone wants to or should switch from, they've done conventional deadlifts their whole training career, and there needs to be an experiment to take place to see whether they might be better sumo. So we'd want to do, as far as the yearly planning, figure out when would be the most appropriate time to run that sort of experiment. And there's all sorts of times where it can be appropriate to use developmental blocks that might not make sense in the context of prepping for a meet, but do make sense in terms of addressing one of that athlete's weaknesses or experimenting with a new technique or things of that nature. And then, like I said, the other aspect of it is purely scheduling. Like, does the person have a vacation coming up at a certain time of the year? You know, what contests are they going to do? Because sometimes, you know, people want to compete 5 or 6 times a year. Sometimes people are only going to do one meet and then do nationals. And you have to take in all of those things into consideration to make sure that the plan that you're coming up with obviously just doesn't blow things in terms of timing, just being completely off in terms of timing, so that you know, there's a time to actually get stronger for a meet, or you don't have them scheduled to do a peaking block when they're on vacation or something, you know, like, so simple things of that nature. But then the other aspect of it is making sure that you give enough time to adequately address weaknesses. So one of the biggest ones that I deal with all the time is underweight athletes. So that's one where I like to try and find time to run extra hypertrophy blocks. So things with higher variety, longer range of motion, and higher reps. I try to find as much time as possible for these athletes to do more of these blocks instead of you know, constantly running like a strength block and a peaking block, like running the same program when there's gaps that need to be addressed. I don't know if that was a really long-winded answer, so I hope I kind of
no, that's really good. Thanks for, you know, adding so many details in there. And then speaking of like assessing weak points, how do you actually go about assessing an athlete's weak points? Do you go by, you know, looking at their videos, or is there something else that you look at?
Yeah, for me, it's really, the videos are a key aspect of it. So one of the things that I really look for first, even beyond like, because in powerlifting, it's pretty common for people to want to diagnose like weak muscles. So they'll say, oh, that's happening because you have weak quads or you have weak glutes. Like, that's why that's happening. I don't generally think like that quite as much. So one of the first things that I look at is just movement efficiency. Does it look like the person is moving efficiently for their leverages? And this kind of is unfortunately like a bit wishy-washy in terms of, I can't really give you an objective way to measure this. But I would say that if you've been in the sport long enough, you can, when you see someone squat or you see someone bench or you see someone deadlift, you can get an idea of whether they're moving efficiently from their body pretty quickly. So you can just look at something and be like, that is probably not what's best for your leverages. You can just tell just by seeing it. You know, especially if it just looks kind of awkward or belabored, or just it doesn't look or flow smoothly. And so whenever I see something like that, that's the first thing that I'm looking for, and that will be evident from the videos. And then I'll have to go through a process of thinking about, okay, is this potentially because of muscular imbalances, or do we need to address this technically and look at revising their technique to a certain degree to make things more efficient? And when we're talking about more just like sticking points, that one's trickier, because sometimes I think people get too caught up with trying to fix sticking points where it can kind of just be like, you just need to get stronger. And that's a really hard one, because in a lot of raw lifters, you know, people will talk about how, you know, they're weak off of the chest or whatever. But that's where everybody's weak as a raw lifter, because that's the point of mechanical least advantage in a bench press, is at the bottom of the movement. Same thing with a squat. You know, when people say like they're weak out of the hole, well, in a raw squat, that's the hardest part of the raw squat. So that one's a little bit trickier, because sometimes there can be a legitimate weakness in the range of motion that you're trying to correct, and other times it's like, well, that's just where that movement's weak for everybody, so you need to just get stronger in general, and probably spending a lot of time trying to fix that sticking point or figure out the muscle that is weak. It can be a waste of time. So I mean, like, a really classic example of this is when a lifter rounds their back in the deadlift. Does that mean that they have a weak lower back because their lower back couldn't hold the position? Or does that mean that they have weak legs because their lower back rounded, and that means that their hips go up a little bit and their knee angle opens a little bit to make the starting position more advantageous? So they round their back so that their legs and hips don't have to work as hard because their lower back is really strong. So then their lower back takes the extra work. Or is it because the lower back is weak and it can't hold the position? And you see, you can kind of make like a logical argument for either one.
Right.
And that's where sometimes I think people waste a lot of time trying to diagnose a specific weak muscle that is causing things, where a lot of times it works better to think about things in terms of positions. So, or think about things in terms of a movement. So, working on adding, instead of trying to figure out whether it's your lower back that's weak, using deadlift accessories that are more flat backed can be high volume flat backed deadlifts with lighter weights can be a more surefire way of addressing that weak point than trying to diagnose weak muscle groups. So personally for me, the biggest things that I look for is movement efficiency. That's number one. Does it look like the person is moving coordinated and efficiently for their leverages? And if so, are they not getting hurt doing that? And if they're not getting hurt and they're moving efficiently, then a lot of times I'm not worried about sticking points, because there has to be a sticking point. Like there's going to be a point in the movement that is the least mechanically advantageous for that person and their leverages. And for most people, it's in the same spots anyway. So if I see somebody who's constantly, their technique holds together well, it looks efficient, and they fail on the squats, say just out of the hole, I'm probably just going to give them more squats instead of saying, okay, that's a quad weakness or something, because while it might be a quad weakness, it's usually a better bet that they just need to get stronger and work on their squats. And if they're moving well, not getting hurt, that's the most important part, because as long as that's in place, it kind of goes back to what we said earlier. As long as the volume is manipulated appropriately, they'll continue to get stronger in that efficient movement pattern and without injury. And that's kind of what we're looking for anyway. So yeah, I mean, that's really my approach to that, is I really try to avoid the weak muscle thing. Yeah. Because in my experience, it's so hit or miss. And more focus on, does it look efficient? They're not getting hurt. Cool. Let's keep progressing it.
Yeah. And so far in your coaching experience, have you worked with powerlifters exclusively, or do you have like general population or other athletes like football athletes or stuff like that?
The only people that I work with that are not either competitive powerlifters or people whose number one goal is strength in the squat, bench, and deadlift, it's like family members that ask.
Right.
I used to do more general strength training stuff as well. But what I found was that it was just frustrating for both me and the client, because my focus is so much on powerlifting that when you get somebody who also wants more done to address, say, bodybuilding concerns, like they want to do more lateral delts or whatever, that's just not my passion. It's not something that I'm, even though I've read about it, it's not something I have like a ton of experience with. Like if somebody asked me, how do I bring up, what's the best exercise, to really bring up the roundness of my lateral delts? Like, I don't know. I don't have years of coaching bodybuilders to do that. So for me, I felt like I could provide a better service to just powerlifters. Whereas when I was working with people who had a larger variety of goal sets, I didn't feel as comfortable that I was the person who could do the best job at that. So at this point, like if a lot of people contact me or they read like my little coaching thing, I'll usually say something like, you need to be planning on competing within the next 6 months for me to work with you. And that's not because I'm an elitist who only likes people who compete. It's just because I want to make sure that our goals are aligned, and I'm providing a service to you at which, I'm best suited to provide. Because once it starts to get outside of anything besides powerlifting, my knowledge steadily and then sharply drops. Like when if a football player comes to me, sure, I know the general principles of strength and conditioning, but do I have 5, 6, 7 years of playing football and coaching football players specifically to get better at football? No. So too much of it, I have to bridge too much theory gap to get there. And I'm not passionate about football. So inherently, I'm not going to work as hard for that client. Even if I want to and try to make myself. It's not my passion.
Right. Yeah, to me, it's really interesting to see how some coaches can actually periodize for people who have like multiple goals. So I have a friend at my gym who was actually into lifting, but he's also into endurance stuff. So I think recently he went to Nepal, and he climbed like one of the highest mountains in the world. So he's into like mountain climbing, but then he's also into lifting. And I actually referred him to check out Alex Viada.
Yeah.
For this kind of stuff. So he actually reached out to him. So, and he's gonna start coaching him now. So I'm interested in seeing what kind of training he does.
Yeah, I mean, that's cool. Like Alex's stuff is like a perfect example of that, because he lives that. Like he races and still lifts. He has coaches that do all sorts of that stuff, and that's what his passion is those combining those different types of training methodologies. So, I would be inclined to kind of do the same thing. It's just like, if someone comes to me with those kind of goals, I'd be like, hey, check out this guy, because that's his thing,
Right. Yeah.
It's definitely, doable. There's no question about that. It's just, it's not my arena. That's why I could put it.
Right. So in terms of content, I think you were one of the first people within powerlifting to actually talk about nutrition, when it comes to powerlifters. Because before this, like let's say 5 years back, powerlifters, like most of them hardly ever paid attention to nutrition, and things like flexible dieting and IFIM, they actually came from the bodybuilding circles. So why do you think nutrition is so important to powerlifters these days?
I think that a lot of it is that people are taking the sport more seriously as a sport. So, when you look into people, like if you go on Instagram, like people will have like their Wilks in their Instagram profile. Whereas like in powerlifting 5 years ago, no one even cared about your weight class. Unless you were setting a world record, no one cared about that. It was just, how much do you lift in absolute terms? And natural lifting wasn't really a thing either. Natural powerlifting, I mean, the IPF existed, don't get me wrong, but people weren't really paying attention to that. So I think the advice kind of was at that time from the powerlifting community was like, no one cares how much you lift at 165 pounds, dude. Just get as big as possible and lift the most amount of weight that you can. Powerlifting is all about lifting the most that you can. Whereas now, like there's a huge interest from Instagram and other things where people are going to the Arnold, going to these crazy venues or getting to travel overseas and represent the United States, especially in like, the IPF, and people want that. They want the opportunity to do those things. And in order to do those things, you have to treat it as a real sport and take things like weight classes seriously. You can't just eat everything in sight and lift as much weight as possible, because you won't be competitive if you do that. So people realized that there was a competitive advantage in terms of manipulating your nutrition correctly. And then once a lot of competitors were doing that, it was no longer a competitive advantage, but a competitive necessity. So nowadays, if you don't manage your nutrition, you cannot be competitive.
Right.
And I think that's where, and again, a big part of that was just bodybuilders converting to powerlifting and then spreading that knowledge. People with bodybuilding backgrounds became powerlifters, dominated. Like Lane Norton's still probably the best in his weight class besides Jesse Norris, but Jesse Norris has a bodybuilding background too. Right. So Yeah, I think that's kind of where it comes from, is that in order to win and get all the rewards in the sport nowadays, you can't ignore nutrition.
Right. Yeah, actually, Lee Norton is like one of the first times I actually heard the term powerlifting, because I used to follow him when he was doing his bodybuilding, and then he started a series on bodybuilding.com called Powerlifting, I think.
Hmm.
I don't know if you've seen that, but that was like my actual introduction to even the term powerlifting, because I had no idea what it even meant, or never even heard of it before.
Yeah, I do know that one. Yeah.
Yeah. But before that, so when I used to do FAT, the power hypertrophy adaptive training, something,
Yeah.
the FAT routine, yeah, that was one of my first routines I ever did before I got into powerlifting. Yeah. So yeah, we talked about nutrition, and um, so in terms of body composition, I know you've really talked about filling out your weight class with as much muscle as you can hold, right?
Hmm.
Without getting like super lean. Um, do you still think that that's the best way to approach it, or is there uh, is it like some people who perform better at a higher body fat, even though on paper they should their wilks should be better if they're slightly leaner?
Yeah, so this is another one of those things where I had to learn that you can't be from coaching, that you can't be dogmatic
Mm-hmm.
about everyone like male. Not all males should be 15% body fat
Mm-hmm.
to maximize their competitiveness in powerlifting.
Mm-hmm.
I think what I would say is actually this, is that almost everybody performs better at higher body fats in terms of just absolute strength.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's a point of diminishing returns and a point at which actually getting too fat hurts your deadlift enough that it hurts your total. But almost everybody performs better at a higher body fat.
Mm-hmm.
So what it comes down to is that as you get leaner, a smaller and smaller portion of people can hang on to their maximum amount of size. And what I mean by that is, like, let's say you're capable of holding, we'll just make up a number completely, 100 pounds of lean body mass at 20% body fat, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a certain amount of people that will be able to hold that same amount or a very similar amount at 18%. But then as soon as you get to 16%, a portion of those people drop out.
Mm-hmm.
They cannot hold that size at that body fat. Then when you get to 14%, another way bigger portion drops out. And then you get to 12, a huge portion drops out. And when you get to 10, it's almost nobody. And then when you get to 8, like nobody, right? Maybe a few people can maintain that level of leanness while holding on to almost all of their size that they had at a higher body fat.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens is that it's just another genetic factor.
Right.
Like if you can hold on to your size while being lean, you should, but not everybody can.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can get into a situation where being lean actually decreases your wilks because you just can't train as hard and hold on to nearly as much muscle as when you're fluffier.
Right.
And this point of when you start to lose a lot of muscle is different for everybody, but on average for a lot of males, it's in that 10 to 12% range.
Mm-hmm.
Where I would say a really good portion of people at 15% lose very, very little.
Mm-hmm.
And then almost everybody at 20% can hold on to their maximum amount. So it's just that's a big part of it as well. And I think the other thing, which I'll only loosely talk about or quickly talk about, is that in the higher weight classes, it's even rarer to find people who can be lean at those weights because there's not a lot of tall, gifted people in powerlifting, because
Right.
generally tall, gifted people play sports that pay them.
Right. Yeah, or they might be doing something like strongman or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. And for those of the listeners who want to learn more about this, Izzy has a really good ebook called Eating to Win. I'm going to link it in the description below.
Thanks. Yeah.
So, and then, in terms of like the Powerlifting to Win and Programming to Win programs, I think that was one of the first, or maybe it was the first program that I saw that actually included conditioning or cardio in it.
Mm-hmm.
Have you have you seen other programs do that? Because I haven't done that. And what was your reason for including conditioning on top of the hard training that we already do?
The biggest reason, okay, well, let me answer your first question. Do I see anyone else who does that? Yeah, there's some other people that do that. I know that Mike Teixeira of Reactive Training System will include cardio in some of his GPP stuff. And so there's some other people out there that do include it, but a lot of coaches won't write it explicitly. The reason why I write it explicitly is because I came from a background of doing starting strength and working with people who had done that program. And kind of what that program is like towards the end of it, it's you do 3 sets of 5 at something that's almost your 5 rep max, and you'll rest for like 10 to 12 minutes between sets because otherwise you wouldn't be able to do it. But what I found is that while that works in terms of pushing your 3x5 max higher and higher and higher, is that it puts you in a horrible position to make progress afterwards, because you can't recover from any decent amount of volume because you've done almost nothing to stress your work capacity, to stress your ability to recover from sets quickly and to recover from a lot of training. So the reason why I include cardio in my programs is I think a lot of people think I'm trying to get them in better shape or something. But the biggest reason is so that they can do more training volume and recover from that training volume. So I don't want a situation where, let's say people have like all these load drops, and sometimes, they might be taking like, say, a 9% load drop or whatever, and they might need to do 8 sets that day. Well, if you're resting 7 to 8 minutes between sets, you're never going to get your workout done. You're not going to have the time to do that. And furthermore, it's going to bury you. Because that's the other problem, is that when you have poor work capacity, you might get an increase. So let's say I have somebody doing a set, like a repeats, right? And they're supposed to do sets of 8 starting at RPE 8, and they're supposed to repeat that until it's RPE 9. People with poor work capacity will get 2 sets. They'll do 1 set of 8 at RPE 8, and then on the next set they'll fail. They won't even get 8 reps. And it doesn't matter if they rested a long time or not.
Right.
So the reason why I include cardio is to make sure that we're stressing those systems and developing work capacity, so that when I get novices and intermediates on the necessary amounts of volume as they become advanced, they can actually handle it. They can actually do the program without failing the sets or without taking so long that it's unrealistic, and just generally being able to recover from more work more quickly.
So in terms of training in general, what is like the biggest mistake you see people making when it comes to like their powerlifting training in general?
So I think it's different for each level, but what I will say is that for honestly, for novices, it's not just milking linear progression enough. And I don't like it when people reset 80 times to try and get like the highest numbers of all time on linear progression. So I think that's kind of silly. But sometimes people, they say that they're finished with linear progression and they gained 3 pounds or something. And it's like, you need to, when you do linear progression, you need to put on weight, you need to do things properly and get what you can out of it. I don't want people to reset over and over and over again, kind of banging their head against the wall. But, you shouldn't be finishing linear progression well below what all of your peers finish. Some people will because of genetics, but that's rare by necessity. So I think novices just want to hurry, and they want to get to intermediate and advanced programs that are more exciting. For intermediates, it's running the same program every week. So they run almost the same program every week. There's just no periodization. They run the same thing over and over and over and expect that's going to get long-term progress. Whereas that stops working really quickly once you're no longer a novice. So like a good example of this would be like the Texas method. Okay. It's like this program where you do a 5x5 on Monday, and then on Friday you go for a 5 rep max, and you just repeat this program forever until you start failing. And you'll start failing really quickly because there's no periodization. So intermediates don't use enough periodization in their routines. And then for more advanced lifters, I would say it's nowadays they get too specific with their training means. And what I mean by this is they never do anything but heavy reps, and they only do the competition movements or something close to that. Not enough variety, not enough hypertrophy work. And what ends up happening is that they remain perpetually underweight, perpetually like a little bit hurt from overuse injuries, always having tendonitis. And it ends up resulting in stagnation or just working really, really hard for not as much return as they should get. So it's another, almost all of these, if you think about it, are problems with impatience. But yeah, that for advanced athletes, it's hyper specificity of training means. This is what I'm seeing nowadays as the biggest mistake. Just they need to include a little bit more variety, especially in the off season, and not constantly run themselves into the ground with these crazy programs that have them squatting 3 to 4 times a week with relatively high intensity and high volume. It's like you need to take some time to step back from that in the off season, with a little bit less frequency, more variety, get bigger, develop weaknesses, and let some of those overuse things go away.
So wanted to know how is your training going these days?
My training's been going awesome. I've been making a lot of progress lately. I've been working with Joe Sullivan. He's a elite FTS sponsored athlete. He's also works with Chris Duffin at Kabuki Strength Systems. He just totaled like over 2,000 at 220 and finished second to Yuri Belkin at the U.S. Open. So he's been doing my programming, but his programming is very similar to what I do. More variety in the off season, more specific as it comes time to peak, more PE based. But yeah, I've been doing really well right now. I'm dieting, so I'm obviously not making like super fast progress or anything. But I've been getting a little bit stronger, and I've been losing weight. So you can't really ask for anything more than that while you're dieting. At least in my experience, I consider a successful diet if you lose a really successful diet if you lose weight and lose no strength.
Right.
Most people don't accomplish that. So
yeah, because relatively you're stronger even if you don't add weight to the bar.
Exactly. So you make huge strides there, especially if you can like drop a weight class without losing any significant strength. That's a big deal. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do. But yeah, I'm as strong as I've ever been right now, and I don't have any real injuries or anything. So yeah, training's going well for me. I can't really ask for more.
Right. And what are your competition plans?
So the owner of the gym that I train at right now is trying to basically at some point kind of get an expo started. So you kind of hear about some of these expos that go on, like the LA Fit Expo, or there's expos all over the country, and he wants to kind of get a Seattle Expo started. And so probably one of the first times that will happen will be this year in January. So since he's the owner of my gym, he's a great guy. His name's Lee Doherty. He owns Ego Strength and Conditioning. I really want to do that meet. So that'll probably be the next time that I compete. That's still a pretty long ways off here though, January. So before then, I'm hoping to at least get a mock meet done in the gym pretty soon here within the next 6 to 8 weeks. And, if there's something that kind of crops up in my area that's right around that time, I'll probably use that as a tester meet for the January meet instead of doing a mock meet. But I really want to compete at the one in January. That's for sure going to happen. And if I can't find something in that window that I'm looking for in the next 6 to 8 weeks, I'll max out in the gym first too.
Any plans of coming to California?
I have a bunch of family in California actually, in Alameda. So I usually make it out there every once in a while.
Yeah.
I don't have any travel plans scheduled right now anywhere actually, but
yeah, I hope someday we can train together at least once.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Yeah.
There's a lot of gyms out there too that I would love to train at.
Yeah. Yeah, you should check out Boss Barbell.
Yeah, Boss Barbell and Barbell Brigade. There's a bunch of really cool gyms out there.
Yeah. Yeah, that'd be awesome. So I think we've been going for over an hour. There's actually a lot of things we can talk about. I think we can practically go on for days, I guess.
There's a lot to talk about with powerlifting.
Right. But I think let's end it for today, and maybe if you have time, we can do this again sometime.
Sure.
Because I think there was a lot of value and a lot of content in this 1 hour itself, so people need to be able to digest it, I guess.
Yeah.
So before you go, where can people find you?
So you guys can find me on my website, powerliftingtowin.com. If you're interested in coaching or something like that, just shoot me an email at izzy@powerliftingtowin.com. But those are probably the main places. You can find me on YouTube as well. Izzy Narvaez. It's one of my YouTube channels. The other one is Powerlifting to Win. I'm also on Instagram. Just type in Izzy Narvaez, and I'm on Instagram there as well. So I'm on pretty much every social media platform. But if you wanted to get in contact with me directly, just email me at izzy@powerliftingtowin. If you want to see any of my videos and articles, go to powerliftingtowin.com.
Awesome, and I'm gonna link everything down in the description.
Awesome.
Well, I want to thank you once again for taking your time and doing this interview for me. It's my very first interview, and thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Yeah, man, no problem. It was fun.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
All right, man. Have a good one.
You too. Thank you.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.